The stale, metallic scent of canned soup was the ghost of their last meal. Elena, 48 and hollowed out by grief, sat at the small formica table of the trailer they no longer owned. Her fingers, calloused from years of scrubbing plates in a school cafeteria, trembled as she flattened the worn dollar bills. $87. The number was a death sentence. She counted it again. A 50, a 20, a 10, a 5, and 2 wrinkled ones. The coins made a pathetic little pile beside them. $87.35. Her husband's face swam in her memory, smiling, before the aggressive cancer had eaten him from the inside out, devouring their meager life savings with the same relentless cruelty. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped and splashed onto the tabletop, blurring the fake wood grain. Her stomach twisted into a painful, empty knot. It wasn't just hunger. It was the raw, physical ache of absolute failure. The eviction notice, a stark white slash on the flimsy door, seemed to mock her with every gust of wind that rattled the trailer's thin aluminum skin. From the cramped back room, a small, wet cough echoed. Sophia, her 7-year-old daughter. The sound pierced Elena's heart like a shard of ice. The damp chill of their final nights in this tin can had settled deep in the child's chest, a constant, rattling reminder of their poverty. Beside her, Leo, her 10-year-old son, was trying to be brave, his face a stoic mask that didn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. He was whittling a small piece of wood with a plastic knife, the soft scraping sound doing little to fill the cavernous silence of their hunger. Elena felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She had given them the last of the soup yesterday, watching them spoon the thin broth into their mouths while she drank a glass of water, pretending she wasn't starving. The lie sat like a stone in her gut. Her own stomach growled, a low guttural protest she tried to stifle. She looked at their small, trusting faces, and the weight of her helplessness felt like a physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs. They had nothing, and she felt like it was all her fault. The finality came with the sharp rap on the door. Time's up. A shiver of pure dread traced its way down Elena's spine. Gathering their few possessions felt like a funeral procession. Clothes, a handful of worn-out toys, and a framed photo of their father were shoved into black plastic trash bags. The bags were heavy with the weight of their shattered life. As she stepped outside, the cold November air bit at her exposed skin, a brutal welcome to homelessness. Sophia coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that made Elena's blood run cold. She pulled the child's thin coat tighter, a useless gesture against the invasive dampness. She could feel the imagined stares of neighbors peering through their blinds, their pity a sharp, humiliating sting. She dragged the bags down the gravel path, her muscles screaming in protest, her spirit already broken. Behind them, she heard the distinct metallic sound of the landlord's tools. A click, a scrape. The lock was being changed. It was done. They were officially nowhere. The streetlights of the small town cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock their slow, aimless shuffle. Each light they passed was a blurry star seen through the film of Elena's unshed tears. She held Leo's hand on her right and Sophia's on her left. Their small fingers were cold and she squeezed them tight, as if she could transfer her own fading warmth into them. Her mind was a frantic, terrifying loop of dead ends. The nearest city shelter was 50 miles away. And she'd heard stories of families being separated. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She clutched the $87 in her pocket. The crisp paper felt like a joke, a flimsy paper shield against the wolves of the world. She thought of her husband, his promise to always take care of them echoing like a cruel ghost in her ears. Then a memory surfaced through the fog of her despair. The parish priest, Father Michael. He had presided over the funeral. He had offered vague condolences, a place to turn if things got difficult. She had dismissed it then. A basement, he'd said, an offer of charity she had been too proud to consider. Now, pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The rectory door was a slab of heavy dark oak. It creaked open, revealing the kind, weary face of Father Michael. His eyes, magnified by thick glasses, held a deep, sorrowful pity that made Elena want to shrink away. He listened patiently as the words tumbled out of her, a broken confession of debt and eviction and fear. He nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. The offer, he explained, still stood. Not in the rectory, which was full, but in the old St. Michael's church next door. It was deconsecrated, abandoned, slated for demolition in a few months. "The basement," he said, his voice soft with apology. "There is no heat, no running water. It's cold, but it's a roof, Elena. It's the only thing I can offer to keep you off the streets tonight." The words landed like stones in her stomach. A tomb. He was offering them a tomb. She looked at Leo, whose shoulders were slumped with exhaustion, and then heard Sophia let out another weak, wheezing cough. The street, or the cold, dark basement of a dead church. Her heart constricted in a vice of pure defeat. It wasn't a choice. It was a surrender. What would you do in her place? Would you lead your children into the darkness just for the promise of a roof? The heavy, ornate iron key the priest pressed into her palm felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly real. It was a tangible object in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare of abstract debts and fears. "God be with you, Elena," Father Michael had said, his voice laced with a genuine pity that made her skin prickle with shame. She clutched the cold metal, the intricate, rusted shape digging into her flesh. It was a key to a sanctuary, she told herself. Not a home, but a refuge. She forced a smile for her children, a brittle mask of reassurance. "We have a place to sleep tonight," she announced, trying to inject a note of adventure into her exhausted voice. Leo said nothing, his 10-year-old eyes already old with suspicion, but Sophia, small and trusting, looked up at her, a flicker of hope in her weary face. That look was a blade in Elena's heart. The key in her hand was a promise she knew, deep down, she couldn't keep. It felt less like a key and more like a stone she would use to weigh them all down. The journey was no more than 100 yards, a short walk across a neglected patch of grass from the warm, lit rectory to the looming shadow of the church. Yet it felt like a pilgrimage to a dead land. St. Michael's rose before them, a black skeletal silhouette against a bruised and dying sky. Its pointed Gothic arches were like praying hands, and the great rose window above the main doors was a single, vacant eye staring into nothingness. The only sounds were a mournful sigh of wind whistling through the skeletal branches of a nearby oak tree, and the crunch of their own footsteps on the gravel path. Each step seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Sophia let out another wet, rattling cough, and the sound seemed to be swallowed whole by the immense stone facade. Elena clutched her daughter's hand tighter, her own knuckles white. "It's just an old building," she told herself, a desperate mantra. Stone is strong, stone is safe, but she could feel the children's fear, a trembling that traveled up her arms and settled like a block of ice in her chest. They circled the colossal structure, their plastic bags rustling like dead leaves in the breeze. The priest had directed them to a side entrance, a low, heavy-set oak door sunk deep into the foundation, half consumed by a grasping tangle of dead ivy. This was the way to the basement. The lock was a monstrous, ancient thing of blackened iron. Elena jammed the key into the keyhole, her cold-numbed fingers fumbling. She grunted with effort, putting her shoulder into it, twisting. The metal shrieked and scraped in protest, the sound of a tomb being forced open after a century of silence. With a final, echoing clang, the lock gave way. As the bolt retracted, a gust of air rushed out from the darkness within, and Elena recoiled, gagging. Her stomach twisted violently. It was not the simple, musty scent of a place unused. It was the thick, cloying stench of deep decay, of sodden earth, of rot, and of the acrid, biting smell of vermin. The last fragile threads of her hope began to unravel. Pushing the door open required all of her remaining strength. It swung inward with a low, guttural groan, revealing a set of steep, worn stone steps that descended into a well of absolute blackness. The air that billowed up was a physical presence, a cold, wet blanket that stole the air from their lungs and tasted of mold. Sophia whimpered and hid behind Elena's legs, while Leo simply froze, his face a pale mask in the twilight. "It's all right," Elena whispered, the lie catching in her dry throat. "There's a light switch just inside." She forced herself to take the first step down, her free hand sliding along the wall. The stone was not just cold, it was slimy, coated in a film of condensation that made her shudder. Her fingers brushed against something thick and soft. Cobwebs. She fought back a choked scream. The darkness was suffocating. and the thought of leading her children into this pitch-black moor sent a jolt of pure panic through her veins. This wasn't a room, it was a hole in the ground. Her trembling fingers, sticky with grime and cobwebs, finally found it. A round, porcelain turn switch, gritty to the touch. She twisted it. There was a faint click, an electrical hum that buzzed for a moment in the silence, and then a single, bare bulb, hanging from a long, black, fraying cord, flickered reluctantly to life. It cast a weak, jaundiced yellow glow across the space below, and what it revealed made Eleanor's heart drop like a stone into the pit of her stomach. The reality was a brutal, physical blow, far worse than her most pessimistic imaginings. The priest's basement was a cavernous subterranean chamber, a tomb of weeping stone. The weak light didn't illuminate the space. It only served to create a small pocket of visibility, pushing the vast writhing shadows into the far corners. The raw, desperate hope she had clung to for the last hour was extinguished in an instant, drowned by a tidal wave of utter despair. This was their new home. The walls were built of massive, unevenly cut flagstones, their surfaces glistening with a perpetual sheen of moisture that caught the sickly yellow light. Crawling across the stone, in fuzzy, obscene-looking patches, was thick, black mold, spreading like a living cancer. The sight of it made Elena's skin crawl, and she thought immediately of Sophia's weak, rattling lungs. The floor was made of the same uneven stone, dangerously slick with dampness and layered with years of accumulated grime and dirt. Everywhere she looked, she could see the unmistakable dark droppings of rats, a grim confirmation of the acrid smell that was now thick in the air they breathed. The sheer, abject filth of the place was an assault on every sense. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to brace herself against the slimy wall. This was not a shelter. This was a biohazard. This was a place where people got sick. Now that they were fully inside, the door closed behind them. The smell was a suffocating miasma. It was a complex, layered stench of things long dead and left to rot. The dominant note was the sharp, musty reek of the mold. An odor so pervasive it seemed to coat the inside of her throat and sting her eyes. Layered beneath it was the pungent, ammonia-like scent of rat urine, mingled with the smell of damp, cold earth and something else, something faintly sweet and putrid, like spoiled wine or decaying fabric. The only sound, now that their own movements had stilled, was the constant, maddeningly rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water, seeping from some unseen crack in the stone ceiling and splattering onto the floor somewhere in the surrounding darkness. Each drop landed with the finality of a gavel, a tiny, repeating sentence of their doom. The cold was not just an absence of heat. It was a physical, malevolent presence. It was a deep, subterranean cold, the kind that lives in graves and forgotten places. It seemed to emanate directly from the ancient stones, a damp, penetrating chill that radiated upwards from the floor, through the thin, worn soles of their shoes. Elena felt it instantly, a clammy grip around her ankles that was already beginning to creep up her legs. A violent, uncontrollable shiver racked her body, and her teeth began to chatter. She looked at her children, her heart clenching. Sophia was already trembling, her lips taking on a faint, bluish hue in the dim light. Leo stood rigid, his arms wrapped tightly around his own chest, his knuckles a stark, bloodless white. This was a cold that didn't just make you uncomfortable, it felt like it could leach the very heat from your blood. As if summoned by her fear, Sophia was suddenly seized by a fit of coughing. It was a series of deep, hacking sounds, horribly loud and wet in the echoing stone chamber. Each cough sounded more painful, more guttural than the last. The sound was a physical blow to Elena, each one a fresh stab of a guilt so profound it made her feel sick. I brought her here, she thought. The words a silent scream in her mind. I brought my sick child to this mouldy, freezing tomb. She knelt, her knees cracking as they hit the cold, hard stone, and pulled Sophia into her arms. She tried to rub the child's back, to transfer some of her own body heat, but she had no warmth left to give. Hot, angry tears of self-loathing stung her eyes. The priest had offered a roof, and in her desperation she had accepted, never imagining the hell that lay beneath it. In the center of the vast, gloomy space, half swallowed by the shadows, was the solid stone foundation of what must have once been the main altar. It was a stark, blockish shape, stripped of any cross or decoration it might have once held. Piled near it was a heap of broken wooden pews and what looked like rotting liturgical fabrics, all of it covered in a thick blanket of grey dust and draped with the intricate lacework of 1,000 cobwebs. It looked like the boneyard of a forgotten faith. These were the ghosts of St. Michael's, a testament to a time when this space, or at least the building above it, was filled with light and prayer. Now, the sight offered no comfort, no lingering sense of the sacred. It only amplified the oppressive atmosphere of desecration and abandonment. This place hadn't just been neglected, it felt cursed. They had to make a place to lie down. The thought was so absurd it was almost laughable. To sleep in this filth, but the street was colder, and the night was fully upon them. "Here," Elena said, her voice a dry, hollow croak. She pointed to a section of the floor near the altar base that seemed, in the deceptive light, to be marginally less damp than the rest. It was a pathetic attempt to claim a piece of this hell for themselves, to create the illusion of a home. She let the black trash bags of their worldly possessions drop to the floor. They landed with a dull, defeated thud that echoed the feeling in her soul. Leo, his face grim, began pulling out their 2 thin blankets and a single, lumpy pillow. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His silence was an accusation colder than the stone beneath their feet. Leo's quiet compliance was more heartbreaking than any tantrum could have been. He didn't cry or complain. He simply worked, his 10-year-old face set in a stony, adult-like mask of grim resignation. He spread the first blanket on the floor, the thin fabric already darkening as it absorbed the dampness from the stone. He carefully laid the second on top, a futile gesture against the deep, seeping cold. His silence was a judgment. It told Elena that he no longer believed in her reassurances, that the childhood faith he'd had in his mother to make things right was gone, shattered by the brutal reality of this basement. He saw their situation with a terrifying clarity. This was the bottom. This was a complete and utter failure. Elena watched him, her heart splintering. She had not only failed to protect him, she had stolen his childhood. While Leo retreated into a shell of stoic despair, Sophia clung to Elena's leg, burying her face in the rough, damp fabric of her jeans. Her small body was shaking, a tremor that was only partly from the cold. It was raw, childish terror. "Mommy, I don't like it here," she whispered, her voice muffled and thick with tears. "It smells bad. There are monsters in the dark." Soft, hitching sobs shook her frame. Elena knelt and gathered her into a fierce, protective hug, rocking her gently. "Shh, mi amor. It's okay." "There are no monsters," she lied, her own voice cracking with emotion. "Mommy is right here. We're safe." But as the words left her lips, her eyes darted into the impenetrable, shifting shadows that danced at the very edge of the light's reach. She thought she heard a faint, dry, scuttling sound, a whisper of claws on stone. For the first time, she wasn't sure she was telling the truth. They finally lay down, a miserable huddle of 3 bodies seeking a warmth that didn't exist. Elena placed Sophia in the middle, a fragile core between her own body and Leo's. She pulled their last threadbare blanket over them, a flimsy shield against the relentless cold. It was useless. The damp chill seeped upwards from the stone, ignoring their thin layers, and settled deep into their bones. The air they breathed was a cloying perfume of mold and decay. Their only lullaby was the maddening, metronomic drip, drip of water from the ceiling. Elena lay on her back, staring up into the oppressive darkness beyond the weak halo of the single bulb, her body as rigid and cold as the stone she lay upon. This was not a temporary shelter. This was the end. The priest had said it was a roof over their heads. He was wrong. It was a lid on their tomb. Lying there in the chilling, damp dark, Eleanor finally surrendered. She let the full, crushing weight of her despair wash over her in a black, icy tide. She had lost her husband. She had lost their home. She had lost every cent they had ever saved. And now, in a final, desperate act, she had brought her children to a place that felt more like a grave than a sanctuary, a place that would surely make her daughter's illness worse. The $87 in her pocket felt like a cruel joke. Sophia's hacking coughs echoed in her ears. Leo's stony, Accusatory silence screamed louder than any words. She closed her eyes, but the only future she could conjure was a bleak, featureless landscape of more of this, more cold, more hunger, more sickness, more failure. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. This was rock bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. Morning did not bring relief, only a stark, grey illumination of their tomb. The single bulb had been switched off to preserve it, plunging them back into near-total darkness, but a sliver of weak, watery light filtered through a high, grime-caked grate near the ceiling. It was just enough to confirm the horror of their surroundings. The black mold seemed even more menacing in the half-light, the dampness more invasive. Elena's body ached with a deep, chilling cold that no amount of shivering could dislodge. Every joint felt stiff and frozen. Sophia had coughed throughout the night, a wet, rattling sound that tore at Elena's soul with every ragged breath. A feeling of profound, soul-crushing failure had settled over her, heavier and colder than the stone floor. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that they could not survive long in this place. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest and making it hard to breathe. Hope was a distant, forgotten memory. Despite the futility, the need to do something, to fight back against the encroaching filth, became an overwhelming compulsion. It was a primal instinct, a refusal to simply lie down and let the decay consume them. "We're going to clean," she announced, her voice a rough, unused croak in the silent basement. The words sounded insane, even to her own ears. Cleaning this pit was like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. But she needed to create a single patch of order in the chaos, a small island of habitable space for her children. Leo, seeing the desperate fire in his mother's eyes, got to his feet without a word. He found a piece of a broken pew, a flat slat of wood, and began to scrape at the layers of dirt on the floor near the altar base. The sound was a harsh, grating scratch, a tiny act of rebellion against the crushing silence. Elena watched him, a painful lump forming in her throat. He was trying to be a man, and he was only 10. The injustice of it all was a bitter taste in her mouth. Eleanor focused on a different task. She began gathering the larger pieces of debris, rotted wood, chunks of fallen plaster, and what looked like heaps of stiff, decaying fabric that might have once been vestments. Her hands, already raw from the cold, became coated in a thick, grey paste of dust and dampness. The smell of decay was stirred up with every move she made, a foul miasma that made her stomach churn. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her movements fueled by a cocktail of rage and fear, rage at her circumstances, and a deep, gnawing fear for her children's health with every breath they took of this toxic air. Sophia sat huddled on their single pillow, watching with wide, frightened eyes, her small form wrapped in one of the thin blankets. The child's wheezing breath was a constant, tragic soundtrack to their pathetic efforts, a steady reminder of the stakes. Every moment in this basement was a poison, seeping into their lungs, into their very bones. Leo worked with a focused intensity, scraping away years of grime. He was a small, determined figure in the vast, gloomy space. As he cleared a patch of the flagstone floor near the heavy stone block that had once supported the altar, he stopped. He was using a small, heavy rock to break up a hardened patch of dirt. He tossed the rock aside when he was done, and instead of the solid thwack of stone hitting stone, there was a different sound, a low, resonant thump. It was a dull, hollow sound, like a drum beat from deep within the earth. It was wrong. The sound was so out of place in the solid, unyielding environment that it made the hairs on Leo's arm stand up. He froze. His makeshift scraper held motionless in his hand, his head tilted, listening to the echo of the strange noise fade into the oppressive silence. He looked at the stone where the rock had landed. It looked identical to all the others, a huge grey slab set firmly in the dirt floor, but the sound had been undeniably hollow. Hesitantly, Leo picked up the rock again. He held it over the same spot, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He let it drop. Thump! There it was again, a deep, booming echo that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of his worn sneakers. He moved a foot to the left and dropped the rock onto the adjacent flagstone. Whack! A solid, dead, final sound. He moved back to the first stone. Thump! A thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement, shot through him. It was a secret. He was sure of it. "Mom," he called out, his voice sharp and loud in the cavern. "Mom, come here. Listen to this." Elena, weary and covered in filth, turned from her pile of debris, annoyance flashing across her face. She didn't have the energy for games. "Leo, not now. I need you to help me." But the urgency in his voice, the genuine excitement that she hadn't heard in weeks, made her pause. She saw the look on his face, the wide-eyed wonder of a boy who had just found a buried treasure map. Slowly, she walked over. "Just listen," he insisted. He dropped the rock again. Thump! The sound reverberated through the cold air. Elena felt it more than she heard it. A low vibration that traveled up from the floor into her feet. She stared at the stone, her brow furrowed. She knelt down, her knees protesting as they hit the cold, damp ground. She knocked on the stone with her knuckles. It was a faint sound, but it was there. A hollow resonance that was absent from the stone next to it. "Push on it," Leo whispered, his eyes gleaming. Elena placed her palms flat on the edge of the massive flagstone and pushed. Nothing. It was a solid, immovable piece of the earth. "It's nothing, Leo. It's just settled funny," she said, her voice flat with disappointment. The brief flicker of curiosity was extinguished by her exhaustion, but Leo wouldn't give up. He got on his hands and knees beside her. "No, look," he said, pointing right here. He wedged his small, dirty fingers into the tiny crack between the two stones. It moved. I saw it move. Elena looked closer, her eyes tracing the hairline crack Leo was pointing at. She saw it then. A tiny shift, a millimeter of movement when he put all his weight on the edge. It wasn't just a boy's imagination. A jolt, like a low-voltage electrical current, passed through her. The despair that had paralyzed her for days was suddenly pierced by a single, sharp ray of curiosity. A loop had opened, a question mark in the middle of their tomb. What was under this stone? She looked at Leo, whose face was alight with a forgotten excitement. For the first time since they had arrived, there was something in this basement other than cold and decay. There was a mystery. Together, they jammed the edge of Leo's wooden scraper into the crack. It was a flimsy tool, but it was all they had. They put their combined weight on it, grunting with effort, their muscles straining. The wood splintered. It was no use. The stone was too heavy, too deeply set. Defeat began to creep back in. "We need something stronger," Elena breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes scanned the piles of debris she had just been cursing. Her gaze landed on a long, rusted piece of iron rebar, probably from a broken section of the foundation. It was heavy and thick, a crowbar, a gift from the ruins. She dragged it over, the metal scraping hideously against the stone floor. The sound was a violation of the tomb's silence, a promise of desecration. She felt a tremor of fear. What were they doing? What if they were disturbing something they shouldn't? But the image of Sophia's pale face and the sound of her wet cough pushed the fear away. There was nothing left to lose. She jammed the rusted tip of the rebar into the crack, the metal groaning as it bit into the stone. She took a deep, shaky breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold iron. "Okay, Leo, on 3, she said, her voice a low, determined command. "Push with me. All your strength." They heaved. The iron bar bowed under the strain, a low, groaning sound echoing in the chamber. For a moment, nothing happened. The stone was an immovable monument to time. Elena felt her muscles scream in protest, her back shrieking in pain, and then, with a sound like grinding teeth, the edge of the flagstone lifted, just a centimeter. A crack of darkness opened up. A puff of ancient, stale air escaped, carrying a new scent. It wasn't the smell of damp mold. It was the dry, dusty scent of a place that had been sealed for a lifetime, the smell of old paper and dry rot and forgotten time. The smell itself was a promise. It was the scent of a secret. A new surge of adrenaline coursed through Elena's veins. "Again!" she gasped, repositioning the bar for better leverage. They threw their weight against it one more time. With a deep, scraping shriek of stone on stone, the massive flagstone tilted upwards, finally breaking free from the earth that had held it captive for decades. It pivoted on its far edge and came to rest with a heavy, final thud, revealing a perfect black square in the floor. The darkness was absolute, a void that seemed to drink the weak light from the basement. It was a gaping mouth leading down into the bowels of the earth. Sophia, who had been watching silently, let out a small cry of fear and scrambled backward. Even Leo, who had been so bold, took a half-step back, his bravado fading in the face of this black, silent hole. Elena's heart was a frantic drum in her chest. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The air rising from the opening was cool and still, carrying that strange, dry, papery scent. It didn't feel menacing like the rest of the basement. It felt dormant. It felt like a time capsule. She peered over the edge, but the darkness was impenetrable. It was a sheer drop into the unknown, a primal fear of the dark, of enclosed spaces, of what lies beneath, made her want to shove the stone back into place and forget they had ever seen it. But the question was too loud now. What is down there? The possibility, however faint, of something other than more misery, was a hook that had lodged itself deep in her soul. She couldn't turn back. Kneeling at the edge, she reached her hand down into the void. Her fingers brushed against something wooden and rough. Rungs. A ladder. It was old, covered in a thick, velvety layer of dust and draped with cobwebs that felt like decaying silk, but it felt solid. It was a path down. She looked at her children. Leo's face was a mixture of terror and awe. Sophia was crying softly, her fear palpable. "Stay here," Elena commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay right here together. Do not move from this spot." She took the old battered phone from her pocket. The battery was at 12%. It was their only light. She turned on the flashlight function, the thin, blue-white beam cutting a weak, pathetic sword stroke into the suffocating darkness of the hole below. The beam revealed a small, square space, no more than 10 feet deep. It was a subcellar, a forgotten pantry. The ladder, caked in dust, led down one wall. Lining the other walls were the skeletal remains of wooden wine racks, all of them empty and collapsing under their own weight. The floor was dry earth, and in the center of the small room, sitting like a forgotten treasure chest in a fairy tale, was a single or medium-sized wooden crate. It was dark with age, its wood appearing soft and crumbly. The light from her phone caught a faded, painted symbol on its side. It was a red cross, the paint cracked and peeling, but still unmistakable. A red cross crate, a symbol of aid, of mercy, of help in a time of crisis. What was it doing here, buried beneath a church? The sight of it made no sense. A jumble of questions tumbled through her mind, each one more urgent than the last. The sight of that symbol vanquished the last of her fear. She had to know. Clutching the phone in her mouth to light the way, Eleanor swung her legs over the edge and placed her feet on the topmost rung of the ladder. The wood creaked ominously under her weight, and a shower of dust and dead spiders rained down into the darkness. She held her breath, every muscle tense, expecting it to splinter and break, to send her plunging into the void. But it held, step by agonizing step. She descended. The air grew cooler, but it was a dry, clean cold, a world away from the seeping dampness above. The thick, matted cobwebs broke across her face, a disgusting, sticky veil she had to push through. Her bare hands gripped the rough, dusty rungs. Finally, her feet touched the solid, dry earth of the cellar floor. She was in. She was standing in a place that had been sealed off from the world for longer than she had been alive. She turned, shining the weak light of her phone around the small, tomb-like space, her heart pounding. The silence in the subcellar was profound, a total absence of sound that was almost a physical pressure on her eardrums. The rhythmic dripping from the basement above was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt ancient and sacred. The air was thick with the scent of dry, crumbling wood, old dust and something else. The faint, almost imperceptible fragrance of old paper. It was the smell of a forgotten library. Her light beam swept across the empty, skeletal wine racks, the dusty floor, and came to rest again on the crate. It seemed to beckon to her. It was the only object in the entire room, the focal point of the whole mystery. It was about 3 feet long and 2 feet high, bound with straps of rusted metal that had long since corroded and broken. The faded red cross symbol seemed to glow in the weak light, a beacon of promise. She approached it slowly, her footsteps making no sound on the soft earth floor. She felt like an archaeologist, an intruder in a pharaoh's tomb. She knelt before the crate, her breath held tight in her chest. The wood was so old and soft with dry rot that it crumbled under the pressure of her fingers. There was no need for a tool to open it. She pulled at a corner of the lid, and with a soft, splintering sound, a piece came away in her hand. A cloud of thick, choking dust billowed out, and she coughed, waving it away. Inside, the contents were covered by a final layer of protection, a large yellowed sheet of oilcloth, cracked and stiff with age. Her fingers trembled so badly she could barely get a grip on it. What would she find? Cans of food, old medical supplies. She pulled the oilcloth away, and her breath caught in her throat. A soft, choked gasp escaped her lips. The weak beam of her phone flashlight fell upon something that shouldn't be there, something so out of place, so impossible, that her mind struggled to comprehend it. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she thought she was hallucinating from hunger and despair. The crate was filled with neat, tightly wrapped parcels. They were swaddled in more oilcloth, tied securely with twine that had grown brittle with age. They were different shapes and sizes. Some were flat and rectangular, others were small, lumpy and heavy. She reached for the nearest one, a flat package about the size of a book. Her fingers fumbled with the old twine, which crumbled to dust as she touched it. She carefully unfolded the stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a thick stack of papers. They were ornately printed, with official-looking seals and watermarks. They were government bonds, war bonds from the 1940s, stacks and stacks of them. Her mind reeled. The face value on them was astronomical, a fortune even then. But what were they worth now? Could they even be redeemed? It was a wealth she couldn't even begin to calculate, a staggering sum that made the $87 in her pocket seem like a cosmic joke. She felt a wave of dizziness, a head rush of disbelief. Her trembling hand moved to the next package. It wasn't a package at all, but a small, heavy pouch made of rough, sturdy canvas and drawn tight with a leather cord. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. She picked it up, feeling the weight in her palm. There were several more pouches just like it in the crate. With shaking fingers, she worked at the tight, dry knot of the leather cord. It took a moment, the old leather resisting her efforts. Finally, it gave way. She tilted the pouch over her open palm, the palm that was calloused and dirty from a life of scrubbing and scraping, and out of the pouch tumbled a stream of dull, greasy-looking stones. They weren't shiny or cut. They were rough, uncut and raw, but there was no mistaking what they were. Diamonds. A handful of raw, priceless diamonds, now sitting in the palm of a woman who couldn't afford a loaf of bread. The contrast was so stark, so violently absurd, that a single, hysterical laugh escaped her lips, echoing strangely in the silent cellar. The light from her phone caught the subtle, oily fire within the stones, a deep, hidden light that promised unimaginable wealth. She let them trickle through her fingers, the small kiln, hardio, heavy stones feeling alien and powerful against her skin. It was too much. Her mind, battered by weeks of relentless stress and poverty, simply couldn't process the reality of what she was holding. One moment she was at the absolute bottom, contemplating the slow death of her family in a moldy basement, and the next she was holding a fortune that could change everything, a fortune that could buy 100 warm houses, 1,000 hot meals, 1,000,000 doctor's visits. Tears began to stream down her face, silent and hot. They weren't tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of shock, of a hope so sudden and so violent it felt like a physical blow. She carefully poured the diamonds back into the pouch and set it aside, her entire body trembling with the aftershocks of the discovery. Her eyes fell back to the crate. There was one more item. It lay at the very bottom, nestled beneath where the parcels had been. It was not wrapped in oilcloth. It was a book, a thick, heavy, leather-bound volume, its dark cover warped and stiff with age. The leather was dry and cracked, and the spine was embossed with a simple, faded gold cross. She reached in and lifted it out. It was heavy, substantial. It felt important. It felt like the heart of the secret, the key that would explain the impossible treasure of bonds and diamonds. This, she knew instinctively, was more important than the wealth. This was the story. This was the proof. This was the reason a priest had buried a king's ransom under the altar of his church. She held the book in her hands, its physical weight a grounding presence in the whirlwind of her emotions. Her quest for a clean patch of floor had led her here, to this moment, holding a forgotten history in her hands. She sat on the dry earth floor of the subcellar, the weak beam of her phone propped up on a loose stone, and carefully opened the ledger. The pages were thick, high-quality paper, yellowed with age, but miraculously preserved in the dry, sealed environment. They were filled with dense, elegant handwriting. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The top of the first page read, "Parish Ledger and Accounts, St. Michael's Church," followed by the date, September 1942. The entries were not what she expected. They weren't records of baptisms or donations. They were lists, columns of names, German and Jewish-sounding names she didn't recognize, and next to them, a series of strange, coded entries. There were numbers, letters, and small, hand-drawn symbols. It was a meticulously kept record of something secret, something dangerous. She could feel the weight of the history contained within these pages, a silent story waiting to be told. Flipping gently through the brittle pages, she saw the entries continue, month after month through 1943-1944, the same format, a name, a date, and a code. She recognized some of the symbols from markings on the oilcloth parcels. The book was a key, a Rosetta Stone for the treasure she had just found. It was a detailed accounting of the hidden wealth. This wasn't a theft. It was a trust. This was a record of safekeeping. This brave priest, in the midst of a world at war, had been hiding these assets for people who were fleeing for their lives. The realization washed over her, filling her with a sense of awe for the man who had written these pages. He had used his position, his church, to create a secret underground bank for the persecuted. He had risked everything to protect the fortunes of these desperate families, promising to be their guardian until the storm of war had passed. Her discovery was not just a treasure, it was a sacred duty. Then she got to the last page. The neat, careful script was gone. It was replaced by a frantic, barely legible scrawl. The ink splotched and smeared as if written in extreme haste and terror. The date was late in 1945, after the war had ended. The words were a panicked, broken confession. He knows. Caldwell knows. He saw the exchange. The name Caldwell was underlined twice. The pen having pressed so hard it almost tore through the page. He threatens me. He wants it all. God forgive me. They trusted me. I have hidden what I can. The rest, he will take the rest. I fear for my life. He is coming back tonight. Accidents happen. The entry ended there, a final jagged line where the pen had trailed off the page. A chill, colder than any basement damp, snaked its way up Elena's spine. This wasn't just a record of a trust. It was the final testament of a murdered man. The treasure wasn't just hidden. It was the motive for a crime that had been buried for over 70 years. Elena stared at the name, Caldwell. It was a name she knew, a name everyone in the region knew. It was the name of the most powerful, most respected family in the county. Caldwell Development Corp. Owned half the town. Old man. Caldwell was a pillar of the community, a ruthless but celebrated businessman. The cold dread in her stomach intensified, twisting into a knot of pure fear. The ledger wasn't just a historical document anymore. It was a weapon. It was an accusation. It implicated the patriarch of the most powerful family around in a secret, murderous crime. And she, a homeless, destitute widow, was sitting in a hole under a church he now owned, holding the proof in her hands, the church that was slated for demolition. The demolition wasn't just a business plan. It was the final act of burying a secret, of destroying the last piece of evidence. The floor of the cellar no longer felt solid beneath her feet. She carefully closed the ledger, the old leather cool against her trembling hands. She gathered the pouches of diamonds and the stacks of bonds, her mind racing. The impossible, exhilarating hope of a moment ago was now poisoned by a deep and terrifying fear. This wasn't a simple case of finders keepers. This was dangerous. This wealth was stained with blood. The mystery of the hollow stone had been solved, but it had opened a new loop, a new question far more perilous than the last. It was no longer what is in the box, but what do I do now? To reveal this secret would be to confront a powerful, ruthless man who had already killed once to protect it. To keep it quiet would be to let a murderer get away with his crime, and to betray the trust of the families whose entire histories were recorded in the book she now held. The single light bulb in the basement above her flickered, and in the sudden shift of shadows, she felt a profound and terrible sense of being watched. Slowly, carefully, she repacked the crate. She placed the ledger at the bottom, then the parcels of bonds, then the heavy pouches of diamonds. She put the crumbling lid back on as best she could. She had to get it out of here. She had to get her children out of here. She looked up at the square of grey light that marked the opening back into the main basement, back into her miserable reality. But it was a different reality now. Before that, it was just a struggle against poverty, against the cold, impersonal forces of hunger and homelessness. Now, there was an enemy, a face, a name, a man who had built an empire on a foundation of theft and murder, a man who would do anything to protect his legacy. She clutched the heavy crate, her knuckles white. The weight of the gold and diamonds was nothing compared to the weight of the secret she now carried. The mystery had been solved, but the true danger was only just beginning. With the crate hidden beneath a mound of rotting pews and filthy vestments, Elena scrambled back up the splintery ladder, her muscles screaming in protest. The air in the main basement hit her like a physical blow after the dry stillness of the cellar. It was wet, cloying, thick with the stench of mold and rat droppings, a suffocating blanket of decay. She felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against the cold, slimy wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with excitement, but with a new and visceral terror. The impossible weight of the crate was nothing compared to the crushing weight of the secret it contained. It was a truth so heavy, it felt like it could collapse the very stone walls around her. She looked at her children, huddled together on the filthy blankets, their faces pale and scared in the gloom. The treasure was no longer a miracle, it was a curse, a ticking bomb she had just unearthed directly beneath her family. The joy of the discovery had evaporated, leaving only the cold, metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She had to see it again, to confirm the nightmare was real. Shaking, she pulled the children closer, creating a small tent with one of the blankets, and switched on her phone's failing light. She opened the heavy ledger, its dry, papery scent a stark contrast to the surrounding rot. The weak beam illuminated the priest's elegant, faded script. Her finger traced a name, Rosner, Abraham and Esther. Next to it, the coded entry was chilling in its simplicity. Pouch B7, uncut stones, approx 40 CXT, Bonds Series E, number 458-470. Beside the date, a tiny, hand-drawn Star of David. It was a ghost on the page. A family, fleeing for their lives, entrusting their entire world to this book, to this priest. Elena felt a profound and sorrowful connection to them, a shared desperation across the decades. The book wasn't just an accounting of assets. It was a list of stolen futures, of lives vaporized by hatred, their last hopes buried in the cold earth beneath a church. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just money. It was blood. Her trembling thumb brushed against the final page, the paper rougher, the ink darker and smeared. The priest's final words screamed silently from the page, a testament of pure terror. He knows, Caldwell knows. He saw the exchange. The name, underlined with such force it had torn the paper, seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. Elena read the frantic scrawl again and again, the words burning themselves into her mind. He threatens me. He wants it all. God forgive me. They trusted me. I have hidden what I can. Accidents happen. The last two words were a death sentence delivered across 70 years. The priest hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. Murdered by the original Caldwell, the father of the man who now owned this very land. A man who had built a celebrated local dynasty on a foundation of lies, theft, and a priest's corpse. A shiver of ice traced its way down Elena's spine. The past wasn't dead, it was breathing down her neck. The truth crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Caldwell Development Corp. The name was on half the buildings in town, on charity plaques, on the lips of every local politician. An empire of respectability and power, and it was all a lie. The seed money that had launched it all was not the fruit of hard work, but the spoils of a murderous crime, stolen from families running from the greatest evil the world had ever known. The sick irony of it made Elena's stomach churn with a mixture of rage and nausea. The plan to demolish St. Michael's was suddenly crystal clear. It wasn't just a routine development project. It was the final act of the cover-up. It was a 70-year-old murderer's son trying to bulldoze the last remaining evidence of his father's sin, to erase the tombstone of the crime that had given him everything. The weight of this knowledge was suffocating. She, a penniless widow, now stood between a powerful man and the secret that could destroy him. Suddenly, a sound from outside shattered the tomb-like silence, the distinct crunch of tires on a gravel path, followed by the low, powerful purr of an expensive car engine. The sound was alien here, an intrusion of wealth and power into their world of decay. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, and she instinctively smothered the light of her phone, plunging them into near-total darkness. She froze, every muscle in her body tensed. Listening, the engine cut out. A profound, heavy silence descended, broken only by Sophia's soft, wheezing breath. Then, a car door slammed shut. The sound was sharp, authoritative, a gunshot in the quiet of the morning. It echoed off the massive stone walls of the church, a definitive, final sound. Someone was here. Someone had come for them. Leo grabbed her arm, his small fingers digging into her skin, his fear a palpable current flowing between them. A long shadow fell across the high, grimy grate, blocking their only sliver of daylight. The footsteps were not the soft, shuffling steps of Father Michael. These were heavy, confident strides, the sound of expensive leather shoes crunching deliberately on the gravel. They moved with purpose, with an unmistakable air of ownership. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. The steps stopped directly outside their basement door. She could hear the faint sound of the man's breathing, a slow, steady rhythm just on the other side of the heavy oak. She pushed Leo and Sophia behind her, her body forming a flimsy, trembling shield. Her mind raced. Who could it be? A building inspector, a surveyor? But she knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it was not a stranger. The air grew thick with dread, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. He was here, the ghost from the ledger, the name that had been tormenting her for the last hour, was standing just feet away. The silence stretched, each second an eternity of pure, unadulterated terror. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, percussive raps on the heavy oak door. Rap, rap, rap. The sound was not a request, it was a command. It vibrated through the stone, through the floor, and up into Elena's bones. She held her breath, praying with every fiber of her being that he would think the place was empty, that he would simply turn around and leave. The silence returned, taut and menacing. Her heart was a frantic, trapped bird beating against her ribs. Maybe he was gone. But then the knocking came again, louder this time, more impatient, each blow a physical jolt to her frayed nerves. A voice followed, a low, gravelly rasp that was still imbued with decades of unquestioned authority. "I know someone is in there," the voice boomed, the sound muffled but clear through the thick wood. "I am the property owner. Open this door now." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. He wasn't asking. He was telling. And he was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did nothing to calm the frantic tremor in her hands, Elena stumbled to the door. Her children were frozen behind her, their wide, terrified eyes fixed on the door. She knew she had no choice. Refusing to open it would only make him more suspicious, more determined. With fumbling fingers, she slid back the heavy, rusted iron bolt. It made a loud, scraping shriek, a sound of surrender. She pulled the door inward, and it swung open with a low groan. A blast of cold, crisp morning air rushed in, carrying with it the imposing figure of an old man. He stood ramrod straight, tall and imposing for his 75 years. He was dressed in a tailored, dark wool overcoat, his hands clad in immaculate black leather gloves. His face was a roadmap of aristocratic disdain, with a thin, unsmiling mouth and eyes the color of a frozen lake. It was him. It was Caldwell. The air around him shimmered with power, and a faint, expensive scent of cologne, like cedar and spice, drifted in, a vulgar intrusion into the basement's stench of mold and poverty. Caldwell's cold, grey eyes performed a slow, dismissive sweep of the scene before him. He took in the weeping stone walls, the pathetic pile of dirty blankets, Elena's filthy clothes, and the 2 small, frightened children peering out from behind her legs. His expression held no compassion, no flicker of pity. It was the pure, unadulterated distaste of a man looking at vermin that had infested his property. "I understand your situation is unfortunate," he began, his voice clipped and dry, devoid of any warmth. He didn't look at her, but rather past her at the squalor of her temporary home. "However, you are trespassing. This building is structurally unsound and is scheduled for demolition in a matter of days. He reached into the inner pocket of his magnificent coat and produced a slim, silver money clip, peeling off a small stack of $100 bills. Here is $500 for your trouble. I want you and your family gone within the hour. The money was offered not as help, but as an eviction notice. Elena stared at the crisp bills in his gloved hand. $500. The sum was a mockery and a miracle all at once. Just yesterday, that amount of money would have felt like winning the lottery. It would have bought them a motel room for a week, a feast of hot food, medicine for Sophia. A desperate, primal part of her screamed to take it, to snatch the money and run, to buy her children a few more days of safety. But her eyes lifted from the money to his cold, predatory face. She saw not a potential savior, but the heir to a murderer. She saw the man whose family fortune was built on the stolen diamonds and bonds, hidden just a few feet away. A battle raged within her, a violent clash between her desperate need and her newfound, terrifying knowledge. Her gaze, against her will, flickered for a fraction of a second toward the pile of rotting debris where she had hidden the crate. It was a tiny, involuntary movement, a betrayal orchestrated by her own fear, but it was enough. He saw it. His sharp, calculating eyes, honed by a lifetime of ruthless negotiations and predatory business dealings, did not miss the tiny, telltale flicker of her gaze. The dismissive, impatient mask on his face shifted. A new expression, a sudden and chilling alertness, took its place. The cold, thin smile he offered was purely mechanical, a predator baring its teeth. "Is there something you need to collect?" he asked, his voice changing, becoming unnervingly smooth. "Like honey mixed with poison, something of value, perhaps." The question was casual, but it hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eleanor felt a jolt of pure panic, a feeling like falling from a great height. He knew. He didn't know what she'd found, but his instincts, the instincts of a wolf that has scented blood, told him that something was wrong. His entire demeanor had changed. The bored landlord was gone, replaced by the hunter. The temperature in the basement seemed to plummet. A cold sweat broke out on Elena's forehead, and her mouth went completely dry. She shook her head, a jerky, puppet-like movement that she knew was utterly unconvincing. "No," she croaked, her voice a reedy, pathetic whisper that was swallowed by the cavernous space. "Nothing. Just our blankets and clothes." Caldwell's reptilian smile widened, but it didn't touch the glacial ice in his eyes. He took a deliberate step forward, crossing the threshold into the basement proper. His expensive, polished leather shoes squelched softly in the grime on the stone floor, a sound of obscene violation. "You know," he said, his voice now a low, conversational purr that was far more terrifying than his earlier command, "I've always found that old buildings like this are terribly dangerous. It's why we must tear them down, for public safety. So of course," he let the words hang in the damp air, each one a perfectly polished stone of menace, a clear and unmistakable warning. His cold gaze then drifted from Elena's frozen face to her children. He stared at Leo and Sophia, who were huddled together and trembling. For a long, deliberate moment, he looked at them not as a person looks at children, but as a predator assesses the vulnerabilities of its prey. The chilling, mirthless smile remained fixed on his face. "So fires start so easily in places like this," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Faulty wiring, perhaps, or squatters trying to build a small fire to keep warm." He paused, letting the image sink in, and collapses. The foundations are completely rotten. Stone and timber can give way without any warning at all. He turned his eyes back to Elena, and she felt their physical impact, a piercing cold that seemed to bore straight into her soul. "Yeah, it would be a tragedy," he said, the words now barely audible, a venomous hiss, "if something terrible were to happen to your lovely children." The threat, now naked and brutal, hung between them in the tomb-like air. The $500 remained extended in his gloved hand, an insulting offer of silence, a key to an escape that was also a cage. Elena's body was locked in ice, but her mind was a screaming vortex. His words echoed in the silence, a death sentence pronounced over the heads of her children. Her duty to the ghosts in the ledger, to the decades-old crime, to the very concept of justice, was at war with the primal, overwhelming command of her own heart, protect her children at any cost. Caldwell stood there, a patient statue of menace, offering her a simple, terrible choice. She could take the money and run, burying the truth forever and becoming complicit in his family's monstrous crime. Or she could defy him and, in doing so, risk the lives of the only two people she had left in the entire world. Her throat was so tight, she felt she was suffocating. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money to save your children, or would you risk everything for the truth? Caldwell's car door slammed shut with the finality of a vault, and the sound of the powerful engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than his words. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, the $500 lying scattered like dead leaves at her feet, each bill a testament to the obscene choice she had just been offered. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked drumbeat in the echoing quiet. The cold, damp air of the basement seemed to wrap around her throat, choking her. He had seen the flicker in her eyes. He knew. He didn't know what, but his predator's instinct had scented the truth, and he had marked them. His threat was not an idle one, it was a promise, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never faced a consequence. It would be a tragedy, his voice echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper that coiled around the images of her children, a wave of nausea so profound it made her knees buckle, washed over her. The game had changed. This was no longer about poverty, it was about survival. She slammed the heavy oak door shut and fumbled to slide the rusted bolt back into place. The scraping sound was a pathetic defense against the power that had just confronted her. She leaned her forehead against the cold, slimy wood, her entire body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Tears of pure terror and rage streamed down her face, hot against her frozen skin. He had looked at her children. He had looked at Leo and Sophia with those dead, calculating eyes and calmly threatened their lives. The raw, primal fury of a mother bear rose within her, a ferocious protective instinct that momentarily burned through the fog of her fear. But what could she do? She was a mouse cornered by a dragon. He owned this town, he owned the law, he owned the very ground beneath their feet. The treasure in the subcellar, which had once seemed like a miracle, now felt like a millstone around her neck, dragging her and her children down into a darkness far deeper than this basement. Her stomach ached, with a hunger that was now indistinguishable from fear. Her gaze fell upon Leo and Sophia, who were huddled together on the filthy blankets, their small faces pale masks of confusion and fear. Sophia's wheezing breath was a soft, constant accusation. Leo's eyes were wide, fixed on his mother's face, searching for an explanation, for a reassurance she could no longer give. How could she explain that a monster wearing a tailored coat had just threatened to burn them alive? How could she articulate the ancient, blood-soaked evil she had unearthed? To run now, to simply take the children and flee into the night, was impossible. Caldwell would be watching. He would have people looking for them. They would be hunted, and they couldn't stay. Every passing moment in this tomb felt like a gamble with fate. Every creak of the old church, every skittering sound in the shadows sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She felt trapped, a specimen in a jar, her every move observed by the cold eyes of the man who held all the power. The world had shrunk to the size of this foul, damp room, and the walls were closing in. Despair was a physical weight, pressing her down onto the cold stone floor. Her mind, a frantic maze of terrifying possibilities, offered no escape. Run and be hunted. Stay and be killed. The options were equally horrific. Her eyes, blurred with tears, scanned the gloomy chamber, searching for an answer that wasn't there. Her gaze caught on the pile of debris where the crate was hidden, and beside it, the ledger, the book, the source of it all. It held the truth, but the truth was a weapon she had no idea how to wield. As she stared at it, a memory surfaced, faint and hazy, from the blur of her first few days of aimless, grief-stricken wandering around the town. An old man. She'd seen an old man, stooped and frail, in the neglected, overgrown churchyard behind St. Michael's. He hadn't been praying. He had been carefully, deliberately placing small, smooth stones on the several unmarked graves that dotted the far corner of the yard. At the time, she'd thought it was just a strange, sad ritual, but now the memory sparked something else. A question. Who mourns the unmarked dead? The thought was a sudden, sharp light in the darkness of her mind. The churchyard was abandoned, forgotten by everyone. Yet this man had come. He had tended to the graves of people whose names were lost to time. Could he be connected? Was it possible? The premise had hinted at a guardian of the story. It was a wild, desperate leap of logic, a straw clutched in a hurricane of fear, but it was the only straw she had. The ledger contained a list of names, of families. Perhaps he was one of them, or perhaps he knew one of them. The image of his stooped, patient form, his careful, reverent movements, filled her with a sudden, inexplicable sense of trust. He was not a man of power like Caldwell. He was a man of memory, a man of quiet grief. In a world that had become a battlefield, he was the only person she had seen perform an act of gentle remembrance. He was her only hope. He was a long shot, a prayer whispered into the void. But she had to try. He might be the one person in this town who would understand. A new resolve, fragile but fierce, began to harden in Elena's chest. It pushed back against the tide of her terror. She would not let Caldwell win. She would not let him erase the history in that ledger, nor the memory of the brave priest he had murdered. She would not be a passive victim waiting for the fire. She had to act. She carefully retrieved the ledger from its hiding place, wrapping the precious ancient book in their cleanest spare shirt to protect it. She tucked it into a worn canvas bag. She would go to him. She would find the old man. She would show him the book and pray that her instincts were right. "Leo, Sophia," she said, her voice low but steady, infused with a confidence she did not feel. "We're going for a little walk, just for a few minutes." Sophia whimpered, clinging to her leg, terrified of leaving their squalid shelter. Leo looked at her, his eyes full of questions. But he saw the new steel in his mother's spine and simply nodded. He knew, with a child's intuition, that something had shifted. The time for hiding was over. Opening the basement door and stepping out into the cold, grey afternoon felt like stepping onto a hostile alien planet. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like footsteps. Elena's skin prickled with the terrifying certainty that she was being watched. She imagined Caldwell's men, hidden in the trees or in a parked car down the street, their eyes following her every move. She forced herself to walk calmly, holding Sophia's hand in a grip that was probably too tight, with Leo walking silently and protectively on her other side. She scanned the street, her heart pounding. There, a few houses down, overlooking the overgrown church grounds, was a small, neat house with a modest, old-fashioned sign hanging above the door, Abram's Fine Tailoring. A single, warm yellow light glowed in the front window, a beacon of fragile hope in the encroaching twilight. The faint, rhythmic sound of a sewing machine, a sound of creation and mending, reached her ears. It was the antithesis of the decay and destruction she had just fled. The shop was a relic from another time. The large front window displayed a single, impeccably dressed mannequin in a dated but timeless grey suit. The paint on the sign was faded and peeling, but the brass doorknob was polished to a high sheen. Everything about the place spoke of quiet dignity, of pride, of a life lived with care and precision. The steady, hypnotic whir and clack of the sewing machine from within was a comforting, domestic sound. It was a sound of work, of purpose. Elena paused on the doorstep, the canvas bag containing the ledger feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. Her courage, which had burned so brightly in the basement, now faltered. What was she doing? She was about to barge in on a complete stranger and unload a crazy, dangerous story about murder and buried treasure. He would think she was insane. He would throw her out. He would call the police, and the police belonged to Caldwell. The fear returned, a cold hand gripping her heart. But then she heard Sophia let out a small, wheezing cough, and the sound propelled her forward. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was soft, tentative. The sewing machine inside stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. She heard the soft shuffle of footsteps, a slow, deliberate sound. A lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches, held by a brass security chain. An eye, cloudy with age, but sharp and intelligent, peered out at her. It belonged to the man from the churchyard. He was smaller and more stooped than she remembered, his face a web of deep wrinkles, his shoulders bowed by the weight of more than 80 years. He wore a simple white shirt and a grey vest dusted with chalk, and a pair of spectacles was perched on the end of his nose. He looked from Elena's desperate face to the two small, shivering children beside her. His expression was one of weary caution, the guarded look of a man who has learned not to expect good news from a knock on his door. He said nothing, simply waiting, his gaze patient but questioning. The smell of hot iron and steamed wool wafted through the crack in the door. "I'm sorry to bother you," Elena began, the words coming out in a rushed, breathless whisper. "My name is Elena. My children and I, we've been staying in the church basement." A flicker of recognition crossed the old man's face. He was the one. He had seen her there. "I am Mr. Abram," he said, his voice a low, soft rasp, heavy with a faint, unplaceable European accent. He looked at the children again, his gaze softening slightly as he saw the bluish tinge around Sophia's lips and the way she shivered in the cold. His eyes returned to Elena's, and they held a deep, ancient sadness, the look of a man who was intimately familiar with suffering. "You should not be in that place," he stated simply, his tone not accusatory but one of profound concern. "It is no place for children. It is a tomb." The word tomb hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact word she had used. He understood. Without another word, he slid the chain free and opened the door wider, ushering them out of the cold and into the warm, cluttered sanctuary of his shop. The shop was one small, crowded room that smelled wonderfully of chalk, hot metal, old fabric, and brewing tea. Bolts of wool and tweed were stacked to the ceiling on wooden shelves. Spools of thread in every color imaginable lined one wall like a massive, dusty rainbow. A heavy, black iron press stood in one corner, giving off a gentle warmth. In the center of the room, on a massive wooden cutting table, lay a half-finished pinstripe suit. The chalk lines and pins a blueprint for a future order. It was a world of meticulous creation, of order and purpose. Mr. Abram led them to a small seating area near a radiator that hissed with welcome warmth. "Sit," he commanded gently, already moving to a small hot plate in the back to pour 3 cups of hot Bino steaming tea, adding a generous spoonful of sugar to the ones he handed to Leo and Sophia. The simple act of kindness, the offering of warmth and sweetness without question, was so unexpected that Elena felt her throat tighten, and she had to fight back a fresh wave of tears. He had asked no questions. He had simply seen their need and met it. He sat opposite her, his old, gnarled hands wrapped around his own teacup, and waited. His patience was a calm, quiet pool in the center of her frantic storm. Elena took a shaky breath, the warm mug a comforting weight in her icy hands. "Mr. Caldwell was here," she whispered, the name a poison on her tongue. Mr. Abram's eyes sharpened, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but his stillness was more commanding than any question. The story tumbled out of Eleanor, a torrent of whispered words. The hollow stone, the subcellar, the crate. She spoke of the bonds and the diamonds, but her voice broke as she described the ledger. "He threatened my children," she finished, her voice a raw, broken croak. "He knows I found something. He said accidents happen." She finally reached into her bag and pulled out the old, leather-bound book. She placed it on the table between them. The ledger, with its faded gold cross, lay there like a holy relic, a physical manifestation of a 70-year-old crime. Mr. Abrams stared at the ledger, his face completely drained of color. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his breath catching in his throat. He did not seem surprised, he seemed horrified, as if a ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun had finally materialized in his shop. His hand, gnarled with arthritis and scarred by 1,000 needle pricks, rose slowly, trembling violently. He reached out, not for the book itself, but to hover his shaking fingers just inches above the cracked leather cover, as if afraid to touch it. Afraid that contact would make the nightmare real. "The St. Michael's Trust," he breathed, the words a ghostly whisper, a name she had not spoken. He knew. Her wild, desperate gamble had paid off. He knew the name of the secret. His cloudy eyes lifted to meet hers, and in their depths she saw not just fear, but a dawning, terrible recognition, the resurfacing of a grief so ancient it had become a part of his very bones. The silence in the small shop was suddenly immense, filled with the ghosts of the past. With a visible effort of will, Mr. Abrams stilled his trembling hand and opened the ledger. His movements were slow, reverent, the movements of a man handling a sacred text. He didn't need to search. He turned the brittle, yellowed pages with an unnerving certainty, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He stopped at a page near the middle of the book. His long, bony finger, the nail yellowed with age, traced a line of the priest's elegant, faded script. Elena leaned forward, her own breath held tight in her chest. His finger came to rest on a name: Rosner, Abraham and Esther. Beside it, the coded entry and the tiny, hand-drawn Star of David. "My parents," Mr. Abram whispered, his voice cracking, thick with an emotion that had been suppressed for a lifetime. A single, large tear escaped his eye and traced a slow, deliberate path down the deep canyon of a wrinkle on his cheek before splashing silently onto the open page, a modern grief christening an ancient sorrow. The past was no longer history. It was alive and weeping in this room. "I was a boy," he began, his voice distant, his eyes staring through the walls of his shop and back across 7 decades. "Just a boy, younger than your Leo. I remember the fear, the constant, gnawing fear. But I also remember my father talking about the Angel of St. Michael's. That's what they called him. The priest, Father Thomas. He told her the story of the St. Michael's Trust, a secret network of hope in a world consumed by hate. He explained how families, fleeing the Nazi regime with what little they could carry, were directed to the brave priest, who devised the system of hiding their assets, creating the coded ledger as the only proof of their worldly existence. He gave them a promise, Abram said, his voice trembling, a promise that their legacy would not be erased, that if they did not return, he would find a way to see this returned to its rightful heirs. He was the last bastion of their hope. He looked at the ledger, at his parents' names, and a lifetime of unanswered questions seemed to settle on his frail shoulders. Mr. Abram's gaze became unfocused, lost in a memory that was as sharp and painful as broken glass. "We were supposed to leave," he whispered. "We had passage on a boat. Father Thomas was holding our assets for only a few days, but someone betrayed us. Not the priest. Someone else. They were waiting for us on the road out of town." His voice broke, and he had to pause, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "I was small. My father, he pushed me into a ditch, told me to run and never look back. I ran. I heard shouting. And then, nothing." He closed his eyes, the memory too painful to bear. "I was found by a farmer days later, half-starved. I never saw my parents again. He was an orphan of a crime that was never recorded, his entire family erased, their last testament hidden in a book buried under a church." Elena listened, her own heart aching with a grief that transcended time. She was no longer just a woman who had found a treasure. She was the custodian of this old man's stolen childhood. Eleanor gently turned the ledger to the last frantic entry. She pointed a trembling finger at the name underlined with such furious force. "Caldwell," she said softly. Mr. Abram opened his eyes and stared at the name. A low, guttural sound, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred, escaped his lips. "That man's father," he hissed, his soft demeanor replaced by a sudden cold fury. "Elias Caldwell. He was a hauler, a nobody. He did odd jobs for the church, hauling supplies, carting away refuse. He was trusted because he was invisible. The priest must have felt sorry for him." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. Elias Caldwell, the low-level worker, the man no one would ever suspect, must have seen one of the Jewish families arriving at night. He must have seen the exchange, his greed ignited by the sight of wealth he could never imagine. He had stalked the priest, learned his secret, and then, when the time was right, he had murdered the man of God and stolen a fortune built on the ashes of the Holocaust. "I always knew," Abram breathed, his fury receding into a deep, weary sorrow. "In my heart, I knew the priest had not abandoned us, and I knew his death was no accident. It came just weeks after my family disappeared. The official story was that he fell from the bell tower while making repairs. A tragedy." He gave a short, bitter laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Father Thomas was afraid of heights. He never would have gone up there." He explained how he had spent his life living in the shadow of the church, quietly watching, waiting, searching for a truth he could never prove. He had watched Elias Caldwell's son, the current Mr. Caldwell, transform his father's mysterious, sudden wealth into an empire, his every success a bitter reminder of the blood money it was founded on. "I tend the graves," he said, his voice quiet again, "for my family. For the other families I knew were lost. It was the only thing I could do, to bear witness, until now." He looked from the ledger to Eleanor, and for the first time, a spark of something other than grief ignited in his ancient eyes. It was hope. "Caldwell is a snake, just like his father," Abram said, his voice hardening with a new urgency. His threat was not idle. "If he suspects you have this," he tapped the ledger with a bony finger, "he will not hesitate. He will not make the same mistake twice. His father killed once to get this fortune. He will kill again to keep it." The stark reality of Abram's words hit Eleanor with renewed force. She had walked directly into the lion's den. "The local police are in his pocket," Abram continued, confirming her deepest fears. "Going to them would be suicide. They would call him before the report was even filed, and we would simply disappear." The small warm shop suddenly felt like a trap, their brief moment of sanctuary evaporating. But Abram was not panicking. His mind, sharpened by a lifetime of caution and quiet observation, was already working. He was a strategist, a survivor. "He thinks you are trapped in that basement," Abram mused, a flicker of an idea in his eyes. "He expects you to be there. He will come back for you tonight." "But there is a way," Abram said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "An escape route he knows nothing about. Before the church had electricity, they heated it with a massive coal furnace in the basement. I remember as a boy, watching them deliver the coal. There was a narrow shaft, a chute, that ran from the back of the furnace room, under the foundation, and opened up in the woods behind the church. They sealed the furnace room itself with brick decades ago, but the shaft should still be there. It's behind the foundation of the old altar." His words were a lifeline, a secret passage, a hidden door in their tomb. A wave of relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Elena. "You must go back," Abram instructed, his tone firm. "You must act as if nothing has happened. He will be watching the main door. He will not expect you to have a way out. Take the crate, take everything. The book is the proof, but the diamonds are the motive. When you get back, find the opening. It will be small, covered with a rusted iron grate. Make sure you can open it," Abram continued, his mind working quickly, laying out the steps of their desperate gambit. "Then you wait. Do nothing. Just wait. Do not leave until he makes his move. When he comes, you will not fight. You will not confront them. You will take your children, the book and the crate, and you will use that tunnel. It will bring you out into the woods just beyond the churchyard wall. You will run directly here. Do not stop for anything. Do you understand?" Elena nodded, her mind racing to absorb the details. The plan was terrifying, fraught with peril, but it was a plan. It was a path forward, a sliver of a chance. It was infinitely better than waiting helplessly in the dark for Caldwell's wrath to descend. "I understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. A bond had been forged between them, an alliance of the hunted, a pact between the guardian of the story and the woman who had unearthed it. They were in this together now. Leaving the warmth and light of the tailor shop was one of the hardest things Elena had ever done. Stepping back into the encroaching twilight felt like willingly walking back into her own grave. The air was colder now, the shadows longer and more menacing. With the ledger safely back in her bag and Abram's desperate plan echoing in her mind, she led her children back across the neglected lawn to the monstrous silhouette of St. Michael's. Every step was an act of faith, a prayer that Abram was right. The heavy basement door groaned open, releasing its foul breath of decay. As she descended the stone steps back into the tomb, the crushing despair she had felt before was gone, replaced by a new feeling. The cold, sharp, focused adrenaline of a soldier behind enemy lines. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of a counterattack, a keeper of a sacred trust. Her mission was clear: survive the night, protect the evidence, and live to fight for the justice these ghosts had been denied for so long. Her first priority was to find the shaft. Leaving Leo to watch over a sleeping Sophia, Elena took her phone, the battery now dangerously low at 5%, and went to the far wall behind the altar's stone base. It was the darkest, dampest corner of the entire basement. She ran her hands along the slimy stones, feeling for any irregularity. The wall was a solid, weeping surface of rock and mortar. For a panicked moment, she thought Abram had been mistaken, that his memory had failed him. But then her fingers brushed against something different, metal, rusted, flaking, but undeniably metal. It was a small, square iron grate, no more than 2 feet wide, set low against the floor, and almost completely obscured by a thick curtain of black mold and ancient cobwebs. It was so covered in filth it was almost perfectly camouflaged. Her heart leaped. It was real. Using the heel of her shoe, she kicked at the edges, breaking the seal of rust and grime. With a loud, groaning screech, the grate shifted. It was heavy, but she could move it. It was their way out. With the escape route confirmed, all that was left was to wait. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Night fell completely, and the basement was plunged into an absolute suffocating blackness once her phone battery finally died. The only light was the memory of the single bulb they dared not use. The cold deepened, seeping into their bones with a relentless, invasive chill. Elena sat with her back against the wall, her children huddled against her, their combined body heat a pathetic defense against the subterranean frost. Every sound was magnified in the darkness. The constant plink, plink, plink of the water, the distant groan of the old church settling, the faint, dry scuttling of rats in the far corners. She strained her ears, listening for the sound that she both dreaded and expected, the crunch of tires, the slam of a car door. Hours passed. The silence stretched her nerves to the breaking point. She clutched the canvas bag with the ledger, its weight a terrifying and reassuring presence in the dark. It was well after midnight when the sound finally came. It wasn't the sophisticated purr of Caldwell's luxury car. It was the low, guttural rumble of a heavy work truck, its engine poorly muffled, its brakes squealing in protest as it came to a stop on the gravel outside. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Elena. This was it. 2 doors slammed shut, not with the authority of Caldwell's car, but with the careless, brutal force of men who break things for a living. There were voices, low and rough, and then the clatter of heavy metal objects being unloaded from the truck bed. A new smell, sharp and chemical, cut through the basement's miasma of decay. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Gasoline. They had brought gasoline. Her heart stopped. Abram was right. Caldwell wasn't just sending a message. He was sending executioners. He was going to burn the church, to incinerate the evidence, and to erase her and her children from existence, burying his secret under a pile of ash and rubble. She didn't have time to think. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded her system, sharpening her senses. She gently shook the children awake. "Leo, Sophia, listen to me," she whispered, her voice tight and urgent but miraculously calm. "We're going to play a game, a quiet game. We have to be silent mice." Before they could protest, the first blow landed. It was a deafening, splintering crash as a heavy crowbar slammed into the thick oak door. The entire basement seemed to shudder with the impact. Sophia let out a terrified cry, which Elena quickly muffled against her shoulder. Leo's eyes were wide with terror, but he didn't make a sound. Another crash followed, louder this time, accompanied by the shriek of tortured wood. They weren't trying to be quiet. They weren't trying to pick the lock. They were animals tearing their way in. They intended to leave, no doubt. This was not a robbery. This was an annihilation. The brutality of the assault was designed to terrorize, to paralyze. "Now!" she hissed. The sound of her own heartbeat was a deafening roar in her ears. She grabbed the canvas bag with the ledger and shoved it at Leo. "Hold this and don't let go." While the men outside continued their relentless assault on the door, Elena scrambled back to the sub-cellar opening. She heaved the heavy flagstone aside, the stone grinding loudly against the floor. She jumped down into the darkness, her feet landing with a soft thud on the dry earth. She grabbed the crate. It was heavy, awkward. The pouches of diamonds inside shifted and clinked, a sound of impossible wealth in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. Another thunderous crack from the door above, followed by the sound of wood splitting. They were almost through. With a surge of desperate strength, she hauled the crate up out of the hole, her muscles screaming in protest. It was the entire history of the crime, the motive and the proof. and she would not leave it behind. "This way, hurry!" she commanded, grabbing Sophia's hand and pulling her towards the back wall. Leo was right behind them, clutching the precious bag to his chest. Elena tore the rusted grate away from the wall, revealing a black narrow opening. A blast of cold, earthy air, smelling of damp soil and night, rushed out to meet them. The tunnel was terrifyingly small, a dark, claustrophobic maw. It was a rat hole. But it was their only way out. Another splintering crash from the main door, this one followed by a triumphant, guttural shout. They were in. Heavy, booted footsteps pounded on the stone floor of the basement. "Get in! Go! Go! Go!" Elena urged, practically shoving Leo into the narrow opening. He scrambled inside without hesitation. She pushed a crying Sophia in after him. She could hear the men shouting in the main room now, their voices rough and angry. "Check everywhere. Find the damn box," one of them yelled. Elena took one last look at the squalid basement that had been her prison and was about to become her funeral pyre. She could see the beams of the men's powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the weeping stone walls. She slid the heavy crate into the tunnel ahead of her and then scrambled in after it, her heart pounding with a terror so profound it was almost ecstatic. The space was horrifically tight, the rough brick scraping her back and shoulders. It was filled with a century's worth of cobwebs and grime, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. She was sealed in darkness, a living burial. Behind her, she heard a loud crash from the main room, the sound of the men kicking over the pile of debris where the crate had been hidden. "It's gone! She took it!" a voice roared in frustration. Then, a new sound, the most terrifying yet, the sloshing of liquid, and the overpowering, sickeningly sweet smell of gasoline flooding the air. Panic gave her a final, desperate burst of strength. "Push the crate! Keep moving!" she yelled to Leo in the darkness ahead. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, dragging herself through the narrow, suffocating tube, the sounds of her children's frightened whimpers her only guide. Behind them, a new, sinister light flickered at the tunnel's entrance, an orangey dancing glow that cast writhing shadows down the brick passage. The roar came a second later, a deep, hungry whoosh as the gasoline ignited. A wave of heat washed over her. They had set the fire. They were trying to burn them alive in the tunnel. The thought drove her onward. She crawled faster, her nails breaking against the rough brick, her lungs burning. And then she saw it, a pale, grey square of light ahead. The end of the tunnel, fresh air, freedom. They burst out of the opening into the freezing night air of the woods, stumbling and gasping, covered in filth, their lungs filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine. They didn't stop. They ran. They ran through the darkness, towards the single yellow light of the tailor's shop. They exploded through the back door of the tailor shop, a chaotic mess of soot, tears, and terror. Eleanor practically threw the heavy crate onto the floor, its contents clattering with the sound of a buried history. Leo, his face streaked with grime, held the canvas bag containing the ledger like a holy relic. Sophia clung to her mother's leg, her small body racked with silent, terrified sobs. The air was instantly thick with the acrid stench of wood smoke and gasoline that clung to their clothes. In the distance, a faint, mournful wail began to rise, the sound of fire engine sirens racing toward the now blazing skeleton of St. Michael's. Mr. Abram didn't panic. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that seemed to anchor the entire room. He locked the door behind them, drew the heavy curtains, and immediately put a kettle on the hot plate. The simple, domestic act, a stark rebellion against the violent chaos of the night. He looked at their terrified faces, the proof of the crime at their feet, and a lifetime of quiet grief hardened into cold, diamond-hard resolve. Ignoring the local emergency number, Mr. Abram pulled a small, worn address book from a locked drawer. His gnarled fingers, steady despite the adrenaline of the night, flipped past local names to a page filled with international numbers. He dialed a long, complex sequence, the clicks of the old rotary phone sounding like the tumblers of a safe falling into place. After a moment, he began speaking, his voice low and urgent, a mixture of precise English and rapid, guttural German. "Es ist Zeit," he began. "The St. Michael's Trust. It has been found." He listened intently, his eyes closed. "Yes, the ledger is here, and the assets, all of it. The proof." He then gave the name spitting it out like a shard of glass. Caldwell, his son, he tried to kill them tonight. He burned the church. There was no emotion in his voice now, only the cold, clear transmission of facts. The final report from a soldier who had guarded his post for 70 years. He gave the shop's address and hung up, the finality of the act sealing Caldwell's fate. They did not arrive with sirens. Just before dawn, 2 quiet, dark sedans with government plates parked silently in front of the tailor shop. The men and women who emerged were not local police. They wore dark professional suits and carried themselves with the quiet, unassailable authority of the federal government. One introduced himself as Special Agent Davies from the FBI's art crime team, his eyes sharp and intelligent. With him was a woman named Hannah Rosen, a lawyer from the World Jewish Restitution Organization, whose calm demeanor radiated a power far greater than Caldwell's brutish force. They entered the small shop with a quiet reverence. Abram laid the ledger on the cutting table. Hannah Rosen's gloved hands turned the brittle pages, her breath catching as she saw the names. Agent Davies examined the uncut diamonds under a jeweler's loupe, his expression unreadable. They listened to Eleanor's story without interruption, their faces grim. There were no doubts. There were no questions. They had seen this story before. The sun had not yet risen when the quiet tranquility of Caldwell's sprawling estate was shattered. Elena, Abram, and the children watched from the safety of the tailor shop's back window, which overlooked the distant mansion on the hill. A convoy of black SUVs, the same kind that had arrived for them, swept up the long, manicured driveway, their movements silent and swift. There were no sirens, just the sudden, shocking bloom of red and blue flashing lights that painted the opulent white facade of the mansion in the colors of justice. Heavily armed federal agents swarmed the property with disciplined, overwhelming force. The raid was over in minutes. The front door was breached, and soon after, the stooped, imposing figure of Mr. Caldwell emerged, not in a tailored overcoat, but in silk pajamas, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He was illuminated by a dozen flashlights, stripped of his power and prestige, a pathetic old man blinking against the dawn of his own destruction. Justice was not a fire. It was a cold, swift, and silent tide. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal procedure that felt utterly surreal to Elena. In a secure federal building, the treasure from the sub-cellar was officially catalogued. Experts authenticated the wartime bonds, their value, adjusted for inflation and interest, a staggering sum. Gemologists confirmed the pouches contained millions of dollars worth of high-quality, uncut diamonds, but the centerpiece was the ledger. Historians and forensic document examiners verified its age, the ink, the paper, the priest's handwriting. It was declared a priceless historical artifact, a singular record of a crime and of a heroic trust. Elena, seated at a long, polished table, gave her formal testimony. Her voice, once choked with fear, was now clear and steady as she recounted every detail, from the hollow stone to Caldwell's chilling threat. Beside her, Mr. Abram told his own story, giving a voice to the ghosts in the book. The empire built on blood money began to crumble under the weight of a 70-year-old truth, revealed by a homeless woman and guarded by a tailor. It's called a finder's fee, or a salvage award, Hannah Rosen explained to Elena a few weeks later, her voice soft but firm. They sat in a quiet, sunlit law office that smelled of leather and old books. The recovered assets will be used to track down the descendants of the families in the ledger, a process my organization has been doing for decades. However, the law recognizes the extraordinary risk and service you provided in recovering these stolen historical assets. Without you, this would all have been turned to ash. The lawyer slid a document across the table. The court, on behalf of the collective estate, has awarded you a percentage, 15%. Elena stared blankly. The number meant nothing to her. She looked at Hannah, confused. The lawyer smiled gently. Elena, she said, her voice filled with profound warmth, your award is $32,220,000. Elena didn't scream. The number was too large and too impossible to comprehend. She simply bowed her head and wept, a silent, shoulder-shaking torrent of tears that washed away a lifetime of fear. The first thing she bought was a house. It was not a mansion, but a beautiful, warm, light-filled home on a quiet street with a massive oak tree in the backyard. Instead of the thick, cloying stench of mold and decay, the air smelled of fresh paint, lemon polish, and the constant, comforting aroma of bread baking in the oven. Sunlight, not the weak, jaundiced glow of a bare bulb, streamed through large, clean windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. There were no weeping stone walls, only smooth, warm plaster painted a cheerful yellow. The floors were polished hardwood, covered with soft, plush rugs that her children could lie on for hours, reading books. Instead of the maddening plink of dripping water, the only sounds were the happy shouts of Leo and Sophia playing tag in their sprawling green backyard, and the gentle whisper of wind in the oak leaves. Elena would often stand in the center of the living room, close her eyes, and just breathe, feeling the warmth of the floorboards seep into her feet, a feeling of safety so profound it felt holy. The cold, rattling cough that had been the soundtrack to Elena's terror was the first ghost to be exorcised. With access to the best pediatric specialists, Sophia's lungs healed completely. Her pale, bluish lips became rosy and full, and her wheezing breaths were replaced by the clear, bright sound of a child's unrestrained laughter, a music more precious to Elena than all the diamonds in the world. The transformation in Leo was just as profound. The stoic, worried little man who had tried to be the brave soldier in their tomb was gone. In his place was a 10-year-old boy again. His quiet intensity was channeled not into survival, but into art. With an endless supply of paints, charcoal, and canvases, he filled their new home with vibrant, joyful images. The dark, fearful shadows that had haunted his eyes were replaced by the bright, all-curious spark of a boy whose future was not a terrifying question mark, but a wide, open road of limitless possibility. He no longer had to whittle wood with a plastic knife. He now had the tools to build his own world. Elena did not forget the darkness. With Mr. Abram, now a beloved part of their new family, she used a portion of her fortune to establish a new charitable foundation. They called it the Father Thomas Mercy Foundation. Its mission was simple but profound, to provide immediate financial aid and housing assistance to families on the brink of eviction and homelessness. The foundation's headquarters was a bright, welcoming office downtown, a place of hope, not charity. Elena now sat at a large mahogany desk, but she was not signing loan documents or bankruptcy papers. She was signing checks that would keep roofs over the heads of desperate families, that would keep their heat on, that would fill their empty refrigerators. She would often pause, her pen hovering over the paper, and remember the crushing weight of her $87.35. Each check she signed was a direct assault on the despair that had almost consumed her, a final act of defiance against the cold indifference of the world, transforming her pain into a legacy of kindness. The evening light cast a warm, golden glow across the dining room. A magnificent roast chicken, its skin crisp and brown, sat steaming in the center of a long wooden table laden with bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. The stale, metallic scent of canned soup was a distant, vanquished ghost. Elena watched her children, their faces flushed with health and happiness, as they eagerly filled their plates. Leo was animatedly describing a painting he was planning, while Sophia giggled, a smear of gravy on her cheek. Mr. Abram, seated at the head of the table, smiled, his eyes twinkling with a peace he had waited a lifetime to find. Elena felt a familiar presence, the memory of her husband, but it was no longer a specter of failure. It was a proud, loving warmth that filled her heart. Her family had not just survived, they had been reborn from the ashes. Their story is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest, darkest tombs, hope can be found, and justice, though long buried, can rise again. What story of redemption would you want to see unearthed next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of impossible survival and hidden truths.